Hey everyone, this video will provide an overview of the carbohydrates. Let's begin with the basics. Carbohydrates are found in all plant foods and milk. Meats and oils, on the other hand, do not contain carbohydrate. The primary function of carbohydrate in the body is to provide energy. It gives us 4 calories per gram. And we know that every cell in the body uses carbohydrate for energy. Some cells, like the brain and central nervous system, use it almost exclusively. The carbohydrates are an indispensable source of energy for the brain, red blood cells, and even our exercising muscles. We also store glucose for energy in the form of glycogen. We categorize all of the carbohydrates into 2 groups, simple versus complex. The simple carbohydrates include monosaccharides and disaccharides, while the complex carbohydrates include starch, glycogen, and fiber. Let's take a look at these simple carbohydrates. I mentioned that the simple carbohydrates include the mono and disaccharides. The monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, glucose is the one that fuels our cells. Fructose and galactose would have to be converted into glucose in the body so it can be used as energy by cells. These are single molecules that require no digestion. They are the smallest form of carbohydrates that you absorb. All other carbohydrates would have to be broken down into these monosaccharides before they could be absorbed. The disaccharides are 2 sugar molecules. Note that each of the disaccharides is made up of 2 monosaccharides that are joined by a single bond. It takes very little to break that one bond during digestion, but it is critical to digest it because we can only absorb the monosaccharides. As we look at these simple carbohydrates, you likely notice some familiar terms. We already talked about the fact that glucose is the fuel for our cells. Fructose is a common sugar in fruits, honey, and high fructose corn syrup. Sucrose is also known as table sugar, and lactose is a milk sugar. The complex carbohydrates include starch, fiber, and glycogen. Each of these strands that you see in front of you include multiple glucose molecules. Each of the little yellow polygons represents a glucose molecule. What makes them complex is that there are lots of bonds between each glucose molecule that have to be broken down, unlike the simple sugars that required little to no digestion, maybe just one bond that had to be broken down. Let's start with glycogen. You likely are familiar with this as our storage of glucose in the body. Glycogen is made by all animals. However, we do not consume glycogen from animals. Once the animal dies, the glycogen is degraded. So in humans, glycogen is simply a storage of glucose. We don't eat it. Each of those little yellow polygons, as I mentioned, are glucose molecules. So you can see how highly complex this is. The next one is starch. This is a storage of glucose in plants. Just like humans store glucose, plants do as well. The plant takes the carbon dioxide from the air, the water from the ground, and through photosynthesis makes starch that is stored in plants. And think about the foods that are starchy. Rice, wheat, potatoes, legumes. These are all plants. Fiber, in the middle here, is a bit different because the bonds in fiber cannot be broken down by human enzymes. So fiber goes straight through to the colon. We don't digest or absorb it. The primary function of fiber is related to bowel health. However, one benefit that fiber does provide is that it slows down how fast we digest and absorb our other carbohydrates. More on that in a few moments. Note that none of these foods that are high in carbohydrates are inherently bad. These are all good, nutrient-dense foods. Now, what does end up playing a role in the health of carbohydrates is what our bodies do with the carbs. I mentioned that the simple carbohydrates require little to no digestion, which means they go quickly to the bloodstream. Complex carbohydrates, on the other hand, take a little longer to digest and get to the bloodstream. Let's take a look at this blood sugar maintenance I'm talking about. Our blood always keeps a specific amount of glucose in the blood at all times. so that it's ready for action if the cells need glucose. For the body to function properly, blood glucose levels must be maintained in a fairly narrow range. When the blood glucose levels go above or below this range, the pancreas responds with hormones. Let's look at the lower section of this graphic. When the blood glucose falls too low, the pancreas responds by secreting glucagon. And the role of glucagon is to signal the liver to break down glycogen into glucose molecules and release it into the blood. This way, the blood will obtain more glucose to go up to that perfect range. In the top chart of the graphic, we see where the blood glucose levels are too high after eating a meal. When the blood glucose goes above the normal range, the pancreas responds with insulin. The job of insulin is to allow glucose into the cells. So if the glucose goes into the cells, it's no longer in the blood, and it brings the blood glucose levels down to the normal range. The times that we have excess glucose in the bloodstream is in a time of too much. Thus, insulin acts to store as fat. It signals the liver to take glucose and store it as glycogen, and it also promotes the conversion of glucose to triglycerides that will be stored in adipose cells. In other words, when you spike blood glucose, then you have a high amount of insulin that is secreted, which in turn stimulates fat storage. Certainly that's not what we want. So let's talk about how we can prevent large amounts of glucose from entering our bloodstream. What we know so far is that simple carbohydrates like the mono and disaccharides, that they digest and absorb quickly, resulting in a high probability of spiking blood glucose. Complex carbohydrates take longer to digest and absorb because there are more bonds to break. They're less likely to spike blood glucose, but that largely depends on whether or not the complex carbohydrate food has fiber and protein in it. Both fiber and protein slow down how fast the carbs are digested and absorbed, preventing spikes in blood glucose. And that is true for both the complex and simple carbohydrates. In turn, we have less chance of high insulin response and fat storage when fiber and protein are present. This becomes very apparent when you look at the glycemic index. The glycemic index is simply a measure of how quickly a food affects blood glucose. The foods that are on the high glycemic end are the ones that are simple carbohydrates or contain little to no fiber or protein. They digest and absorb quickly and are more likely to spike blood sugars. Foods on the low end of the glycemic index are ones with little carbohydrate or carbohydrate foods that contain large amounts of fiber or protein. Note that milk is on the lower end of the spectrum. Even though carbohydrate in milk is simple sugar, lactose, the amount of protein that is in the milk slows down how quickly it is absorbed. Now, please don't mistake this for plant-based milk. Many of the plant-based milks, such as almond and oat milk, are very low in protein and won't have the same effect. However, they may also be lower in carbohydrate. The problem with the glycemic index is that it is based on individual foods, and while we don't eat individual foods, we are supposed to eat foods in meals. And as soon as you combine a high glycemic index food with a protein or fiber, it decreases how fast it affects the blood sugars. This is why we have my plate and why those with diabetes never eat carbohydrates without protein at their meal. Let's take this a step further. Previously, I said that carbohydrate foods are not inherently bad, and this is true. Milk is sugar, lactose, but has a lower effect on blood sugars. So how do we judge whether or not a food is a good carbohydrate? Let's start with the simple sugars. The way that we judge the health of simple sugars is by whether it is added or natural. Natural sugar is that which was always in the food, such as milk or fruit. There are two reasons why natural sugar is considered healthier. One, it is not likely that you will consume too much sugar when eating these foods. They naturally contain a good amount of sugar, and it is not likely that we will overeat them. Second, while these foods contain large amounts of sugar, they also have fiber and or protein too. Thus, they're less likely to spike the blood sugars. Now, added sugars are those foods that have had sugar added to them. The sugar may have been added by you at home or by the manufacturer. The tricky part is that the sugar being added is normally from natural sources. To be fair, sugarcane is as natural as agave. It doesn't matter what the source is or how natural you think it is. If it's added to a food, it is considered an added sugar and it's no longer as healthy. Why? Because the amount added is generally too much for you, or you are more likely to eat larger amounts of that food due to the level of sweetness. In other words, you are likely to consume much larger amounts of sugar when it is added to foods. Remember, this has a higher probability of spiking the blood sugars. What about the complex carbohydrates? One of the largest portions of our complex carb intake is from grains, like wheat and rice. To determine the health of complex carbohydrates, we look to processing. Whole grains contain all the portions of the grain, which include the germ, which is a nutrient-rich, fat-dense inner part of the whole grain. Lots of good stuff packed in there. The endosperm is this light yellow center, and it's mostly made up of starch with a little bit of protein. The bran is the outer layer, and this is more of a protective covering that is a high source of fiber, and there's also some B vitamins and trace minerals. Foods that are whole grain or made from whole grain flours are a rich source of fiber, starch, protein, B vitamins, vitamin E, and unsaturated fats. The high fiber and protein helps slow down carbohydrate digestion and prevents blood glucose from spiking. Oh, but many years ago, manufacturers found out that when they refined the grain and removed certain parts of it, they got a softer, chewier, lighter product that was very appealing to Americans. Now, this refining process removes all but the endosperm, which is mostly starch and a small amount of protein. We lose fiber and most of the nutrients. In turn, the government does require manufacturers add the vitamins back in, but they don't add the fiber or protein back in. Note that refined grains are complex carbohydrates. They have starch, which is complex, not simple. The problem with refined grains is not the carbohydrate, but the lack of fiber and protein to slow down how quickly the carbs enter the bloodstream. So what does that mean for foods that you should eat or recommend to others? We want to choose foods that have natural source of sugars like fruits and milk, whole grains or foods made from whole grain flours, legumes, all those great beans that we eat, and starchy vegetables, preferably at meals when you have other protein sources with them. We should limit or even avoid added sugars and refined grains. Many of you are already thinking about how all this relates to long-term problems. You should already see the impact on obesity, high percent body fat, heart disease, fatty liver, and diabetes. The difference between healthcare professionals and the rest of the world is that we understand and can explain these relationships. One of my pet peeves is when a healthcare professional spouts off a general guideline. Anyone can memorize guidelines. The reason people can't follow guidelines is because they cannot translate it into specific change. You will find it difficult to be specific and make those connections between nutrients, body processes, diseases, and how we eat because it's not easy. If it was easy, anyone could do it.